Hello and welcome back to this edition of the Blame Game. Worlds is just around the corner. The ramp up is starting and fans should be getting excited, but unfortunately there's been a lot of community discussion in the last week or two about the format from Riot not getting updated to what they have been asking for a very long time. Now, normally I save this discussion for after Worlds to then retro back on how it went, given the format and whatnot, but with how much conversation is going on right now, I decided I'll chime in and we'll get this out of the way. In this video, I'll do a little bit of table setting on the current situation, why Riot might not have wanted changes, why people understandably want changes, go through some of the proposals, such as copying VCT, and then again, submit kind of my own ideas for things that I think can solve some of the problems. So, starting out with the table setting, one of the reasons that it's more vehement this year, the blowback for the lack of changes, is because last year there was a press conference held and a lot of the media asked, are you guys going to change the format? There's been a lot of conversation. Year after year after year, people asked for it. And there was a point where, I forget if it was John Needham or who it was exactly, but someone from the global esports team said, we'll take a look at the format, and we'll see what happens. I think that made people assume that a change of some kind was coming at least, and it's pretty much the exact same as it was last year. So that caused people now, when they see the actual format to come out, to have this negative reaction, and it's something that's been building for a long period of time. And the fact that it seemed like there was this glimmer of hope potentially last year, and then to not have it acted upon, has caused, I think, the big disruption on Reddit and kind of the Western Hemisphere English-speaking conversation around Worlds. And that's going to transition us onto why potentially Riot might not have done it. This is my chance to be a shill and protect my job a little bit. I think there are some somewhat understandable reasons for why they would hold back on making any changes. For example, if you are making a drastic change to the actual format such that it would impact the planning of the physical locations that you're going to, in terms of how many days you're going to need these places, how far apart they can be, if you're going to be adding more show days or something like that. Also with show days comes budgeting. Do you have to pay people more money now for longer days, more days, these kinds of things? There's a lot of logistical issues that you would need to solve. And the thing about Worlds is it's such a significant event that, from my understanding, as not an event planner and not on the global esports team, most of the time they are looking at venues and locations and stuff well in advance. You hear the announcements of who's getting Worlds which year because they're already planning for what they're trying to do. And so it's very possible that someone asked this question and someone said, yeah, we'll look at the format, but they were already very far into planning Worlds in North America, its return for the first time in 6 years. And if you are going to be moving cities, and America's a pretty big country, if you're trying to move places and suddenly you're like, oh, well, double elimination would require us to have 4 days of games during these semifinals, which currently has 2. That means that it's going to be harder to travel, and you can start getting into all these kinds of problems. And I can see how, if they were already far along in certain planning, then the format is actually limited somewhat by the event planning. That's not to say that other tweaks couldn't have happened. Like, if you do know the show days already, there are other changes that you could make. So the lack of any change, I think fans can understandably still be a little bit upset at. But I do think that there's a question about what is the identity of Worlds, which I'll dig into in just a second. And maybe some of these minor tweaks that you could fit aren't really worth the effort right now, and you're going to save a lot of changes for a big scope change maybe in the future. And if that big scope change isn't coming, then of course it is disappointing. The other thing is that it could potentially only be a Western sentiment about the dislike of the lack of double elimination formats. I don't know, because I'm not in the know on the Korean forums and the Chinese forums how they feel, because we get a lot of LP Hell versus LCK. Those guys are eating good when it comes to their best of 5 matchups. So I expect that it's probably less of an issue from them, as well as the fact that LCK does not have double elimination in their own regional playoff system. So it's kind of more in line with how they do things. It's also kind of the history and tradition of always doing single elimination at Worlds. And so for these teams who are competing and actually making the deep runs at Worlds, maybe they don't care as much. And especially given the size of the Chinese market compared to North America and Europe and the English-speaking languages, if it's only NA and EU circles making this big bluster, well, unfortunately, we're not enough to move the needle by ourselves. Now, if the Chinese community does care, or if there's a way to make these changes without pissing off the Chinese community or the Korean community, then of course, you should probably explore making these changes anyways, because it's going to serve your global fan base and not just China, who's, you know, they're in world finals every single year. So hopefully that gives a bit of a balanced perspective, my little Riot shilling. I just think that there are potentially some reasons. I understand why the community is frustrated, but there might be some reasons why it was not this year that the changes happened. But hopefully that this outcry at least shows that these are people who really, really care. And I think Worlds, as I mentioned before, is in an interesting spot in terms of its identity right now. Slowly, they've been adding more and more major region teams to Worlds and making it harder and harder for the minor region teams to make it to the world stage. They made a very, what I would call actually smart decision in the wildcard play-in tournament, which is called the IWCQ back in the day, International Wildcard Qualifier, which only had wildcard teams competing. And because there were no major region teams competing in there, it was kind of treated as like this discount step tournament that led into Worlds, and the viewership wasn't that great, and it didn't get the resources that the other things did. And now with LPL teams competing, and LCK teams, and NA and EU all competing in the play-in portion, the viewership has been way better. And that does matter for selling sponsorships for that part of the tournament. And so I think there was a very good reason that they did this, but now it's led to situations where, like, could ANX happen in the modern day and age? You know, when ANX had that incredible escape from groups, you know, in 2016, probably couldn't happen again now. Supermassive beat Mad Lions after Mad Lions got overperformed. Legacy was second in that playing group, and then they had to play LGD to get out, to make it to the main stage of groups. That's just brutal. This year, you're going to have to be better than NA number 3, EU 3-4, KR4, and LPL4. Those 5 teams competing for 4 spots who are all from major regions right now. And I know EU is just their 4th seed in there right now because of what was going on with the LCL. At the end of the day, there would only still be 4 spots for 4 major region teams, and you're gonna need to supplant one of them. And it's possible to do that. And I talk about us being 4 major region teams. I know there's some debate about VCS and PCS and some of the those regions kind of being somewhere between the two. But that, more to my point, just says that it's very competitive right now, and the minor region teams that are not VCS, PCS, and, you know, not in that kind of middle ground have a very hard road to qualify for Worlds and actually have a spot now, because we've just been giving more spots to major regions. And so the question is, are we trying to make the most competitive tournament possible? Because then it makes sense to give a lot of extra seeds to LPL and LCK and all this stuff. And we probably shouldn't spend so much time incorporating the minor region teams who, no offense, realistically have no chance of winning Worlds. If Worlds is just about finding the best teams and having the best competition, you should spend more time of the tournament giving the best teams time to play, as opposed to having them waiting for this, you know, 2 weeks or whatever it is of play-ins to wrap up before launching into the rest of Worlds. You should just have them going from the beginning, in theory, if you only care about the best competition. But if you do care about regional representation, then why are we crowding them out constantly with 4 seeds and extra seeds for these other major regions? It just feels like the World's identity is kind of at a breaking point right now, where you have to lean fully one way or the other, or start leaning more one way or the other, because it also leads to a lot of problems with seeding. And I guess this will be the transition point now to talk about why things should change. So despite how much I just talked about play-ins and which teams are representing which regions and what the identity of Worlds is, the point of this video is not to actually debate that. It's more just about the format itself. And so let's dig into some of the reasons to actually change the format just for what it is right now. There's a problem where there's a really big lack of regional competition between rivals like NA and EU. It's very possible for many Worlds now that we just don't play a best of 5 against each other, because we both get out usually as the number 2 seeds, with the Korean or LPL team usually getting the 1 seed. Even if that does happen, we kind of have to hope we draw into each other, against each other in the bracket to get a matchup. And if that doesn't happen, we're probably not seeing each other unless we both win, which is, again, unlikely. So there's a chance that we see each other, but even then, it's very, very unlikely, just because of how the seeding works right now, and the fact that there's no lower bracket. Now, this losers bracket is something that was not there really for a large portion of the competitive history of LoL esports, and it wasn't until somewhat recently, in the last couple of years, that a lot of regional leagues have started attaching lower brackets onto their playoff format. And we're at a point now where 3 of the 4 major regions now have a lower bracket attached to their playoff system, with the LPL, LEC, and LCS all doing it. LCK being the only holdout, but they have had notoriously terrible playoff formats for a while now. So it does seem to be at least regionally decided that double elim is good and something that they want to have, because it gives more matches, more things to do. And if you look at it, a lot of winners have come from the lower bracket in these regions. It's happened enough times that you can't ignore the fact that a single best of 5 doesn't always paint the entire picture of who's better and who's not. Now, if you want to just make Worlds a high stakes tournament, fair enough. I think there's debates about who cares about what more. I know there are portions of fans who like the high stakes, this is it, show up on the day, win or you're out kind of feeling, and that the lower bracket in theory diminishes that high risk tension. Though a lot of the times there's really nice storylines for teams getting second chances to iron things out and make that kind of losers bracket run and eventually get a rematch or do really cool stuff. There's been a lot of amazing storylines in esports about lower bracket runs, whether it's FGC or Dota or whatever. The lower bracket run is a really cool part of esports. The other really big problem, and I would say substantially bigger, if there's a part of this video that I want you to actually get a takeaway from, it's right here, and it's that the seeding for Worlds is absolutely terrible. Both the seeding for the group stage and how teams from the world come together, but then coming out of group stage in terms of actually assembling a top to bottom list of how good these teams are. And you get horrendous matchups early on in the tournament. I should say great matchups early on in the tournament. Look at 2018, KT versus IG. Those were arguably the best 2 teams in the world. IG struggles a little bit against Fnatic. Fair enough if you want to put Fnatic in there, but either way, these teams should not be playing in quarters. It's one of the only full game best of 5s. It's an incredible series. KT ends up dropping it. This game included a base race where there was one hit, an extra second. That was all that it took to separate who actually wins this series, arguably. And then KT's just out. No lower bracket run, unlucky draw. You got the best team in the world in your quarterfinal matchup. You're maybe the second best, maybe third best, who knows. From there, IG just sweep the rest of the tournament. And it's insane and unfortunate for KT that that's the legacy that they have now, is just being that little footnote when with a lower bracket, they could have made that run. And the lower bracket would protect that, but also better seeding can protect that too. I think that's one of the things that people sometimes gloss over right now when they look at potential seeding issues in the bracket stage of Worlds, is they just look at, well, a lower bracket would have saved that. But oftentimes a properly seeded bracket would have protected from some of these unfortunate matchups happening early on, or same side situations where one side just turns into the LPL bracket. Like certain ways of finding better seeding can protect you from that. Now, before I dig into my solve on this issue, I want to take a look at the VCT situation that arose to the #1 thread over the weekend on the subreddit for a little bit, talking about how World should just copy the VCT format, which is very successful for a lot of people. And I looked at why it works, why it doesn't work. There were people, having different sides to this, and I think I landed on the side that it doesn't actually really work if you were going to copy it directly. For people who are not aware of exactly how the VCT format works, once you get to the main stage of Worlds, or VCT, excuse me, it looks very similar to Worlds, where there's 4 groups of 4 who then get seeded into a playoff bracket where there's 8 teams. And then those 8 teams play, but then there's just a losers bracket kind of stapled on that plays out pretty straightforward. Hopefully my editor will put it on screen here. The problem is twofold with this. First off, that they're using Swiss to settle their groups, and it's best of 1 Swiss if I understand it correctly. So you play that one map to beat your opponent, and then you don't know how Swiss works. The winners in the group play each other, the losers in the group play each other, and then the winner and the loser play each other for 2 to get out and 2 to get knocked out. The other thing it does is it uses best of 3s the entire way through until kind of the losers finals and then grand finals. And they're able to get 2 games or 2 series a day into their broadcast this way. This is where there's critical differences in Valorant to League of Legends, and why this format is more acceptable in that environment than I think it would be in ours. And I'm not a Valorant pro, but there are certain things that make that game less snowbally and less volatile than League of Legends is. First and foremost, as I understand it, it's pretty common to get back to parity at different points in a match. You're eco for a little bit, you'll build up so you can do a full buy, and then you can do a full buy and be basically on an even playing field for that round. League doesn't do that. If you get shit on early, you're going to be behind for the entire rest of the game until you're able to make a way back in. And so big mistakes early on. If you lose a pistol round, you have to eco for a little bit or whatever. But in League, if you fuck up a level 1 or your early ganks or pathing or something goes horribly wrong, you're in a lot of trouble. You can just lose the game off that stuff. That's one of the big ways that better teams lose to worse teams. The other problem is that in League of Legends, you can make one critical mistake that costs you the entire game. If you fuck up at Baron, the game is over. This is the other way that great teams lose to teams that are much worse than them. No offense to EG at at MSI, but their wins came off enemy teams making big mistakes at Baron a lot of times in group stage when they took down people that were better than them. Like that stuff doesn't really happen in VCT. Like there's no way to you can make big mistakes. Yes, underdog stories can happen and stuff like that. There are big mistakes, but I don't think you can lose the entire map based off this one decision, unless it's literally the last round, but how did you get there in the first place, So in that sense, a catastrophic mistake in League of Legends is much worse than in VCT. And what this means to me is that a best of one in a VCT setting is more likely to tell you who is the better team. I think League is an extremely volatile game that makes it so fun to watch and so fun to play because every game is so different. But you do need a high quality or high number of games, to make sure that you're starting to see who's actually winning. So they're able to slam through their group stage faster than we could because we would still probably need to do a double round robin tournament. It's going to take a lot more time for that group stage to get into the part where you finally get into the upper bracket part. And even then, we probably should not be doing best of threes. We can, and it would feel okay if we wanted to do it. I personally, I don't know. It's a little weird to me. I do like best of fives quite a bit for League of Legends. And if you do best of fives in their format, then you cannot have multiple ones a day because the broadcast hours start to get ridiculous potentially. And so you would have to have substantially more days than you can fit into the slow end of the Worlds format right now. Worlds goes from 4 best of fives in a week down to 2 days, down to 1 day. And even if you jam all of them with 4 days, you're still gonna end up with too many matches to solve in this current format of the VCT. So I don't think the VCT format tracks directly onto Worlds very well at all. The final problem with the VCT situation is that even if you did find a way to make that work perfectly, you still have a problem with seeding the groups. In Worlds right now, there's so much controversy around group draw every time, groups of death, groups that end up very easy. The teams do not have regional parity. It does not have an environment where these teams are going to get seeded correctly right now unless you do something to really fix how that's done. A Swiss system and leading to all this stuff is still going to be a problem at Worlds, and how you seed the bracket afterwards with 4 groups is still a problem. Even if you have a lower bracket to kind of solve for that situation, I would prefer seeing some other changes to fix that as well. That brings me to what I would like to see change for Worlds and some of my personal solves going forward. Now, let's talk about the current world problems in terms of things that I'm trying to fix with this suggestion, and then some of the constraints that I'll need to deal with over on this side of the page. This is going to be very similar to my MSI video if you've seen that, but a very different solution for a very different tournament. So, what are the problems right now? First off, regional parity is weak. You cannot realistically treat the number 1 seed from NA and EU like the number 1 seed from LPL and LCK. We've never won Worlds. They have won Worlds, both regions, multiple times and have taken place in many more finals than us. Pretending that we're all equal just leads to bad groups. And I don't want to pretend that there's regional parity when there is not. This is a big issue for me and what is the cause of a lot of the problems we see at Worlds, both in terms of the group stage situation and how that gets seeded, and then also for the fact that how it's going to play into the bracket afterwards. Seeding is not reflective of a team region strength, which is a kind of reflection of that, but you also still want regions to play against each other. So you do want to have these teams all kind of separated in a way that they get to play each other, but you want to make sure that the seeding is fair. Another problem is that the low number of series means few regional battles, kind of getting into what I'm talking about, where you want to still see a lot of these things. And then the play-ins is a can of worms right now with a lot of questions about what the identity of Worlds is trying to be. Going over here, we can talk about what we need to conserve from the current format, assuming that we don't want to vastly increase the number of days or weeks that go on here. I think you can get more days in a safer way than you can get more weeks in, because that asks like hotel fees to go up substantially for everyone working on the show and some things like that. You want a single stream. We've always done single stream. I know things like Dota and the International do multi-stream. It can work, but I think I am okay with Worlds preserving this identity of single stream. There's only one game going on at a time. Everyone watches that game. You'll need to preserve normal broadcast hours. You can't just start slamming extra days. Travel must be possible between cities. This is the one where I have the least insight that I can share on, because I don't know exactly how long it takes to pack up a venue to then move to another venue. I think they do it really quick. You know, like you're pretty much out of there the night that you finish. And then it's a question about getting there and setting back up. Concerts move all the time. So I know you can move pretty quickly. But if you start increasing the number of days, you will have more constraints on travel. Finally, the format does need to have fairly seeded both groups and bracket, which is what I am most concerned about. So with that, let's get into what my solve is. So to start, you have 16 teams that you're going to need to figure out what to do with. I've basically put in the ones that are expected to make the main stage of Worlds if everything goes to chalk for this year. And 12 of those are waiting in groups and 4 are competing in play-ins. I will not get into how to solve play-ins, like I said. But what I would like to do is take the 4 groups of 4 teams at Worlds and just condense them down to 2 groups with 8 teams in each of them. Now, if there's a single change that I want Worlds to make going forward into the future, it's to take the 4-group system and change it to a 2-group system. And that will give you so many opportunities to not just make the format better, but also to problem solve into the future and kind of future-proof the tournament going forward. We'll get into all that stuff, but the very first thing you can do is how you actually build these groups has a lot of potential to do interesting things. You can kind of keep a group draw based off seeding once you evaluate the teams into stricter pools of seeds, because right now you have 4 teams in each pool because one group will need one in each of them. But realistically, you could just have only 2 in each pool and separate them into Group A and Group B all the way down the list. You could theoretically do it that way. Another way to do it, which we've done for North America, if you're not a North American fan, but you might have missed it anyways, is a Nemesis draft. And what a Nemesis draft is doing is basically you are selecting who goes into the other group's pool. In theory, you would see this with the LPL number 1 and LCK number 1 as well. You can determine who does this based off teams that are in the World Finals. You could also just do it based off the 2 strongest regions using what is kind of the calculated average placing that they use right now to kind of determine some of this stuff. But either way, the team that goes in Group A would be picking who they want to stick into Group 2. This incentivizes you to pick the team that you evaluate as the strongest and stick it in the other group away from you. You can then go to the other group and say, okay, who are you gonna do? So LPL number 1 slams LPL number 2 in there, LCK number 1 slams LCK number 2 in here. You then ask those teams to decide who they want to go into the other group. So now the LPL number 2 team would theoretically say LCK number 3, and the LCK number 3 would put the LPL number 3. And you go down filling this out. And once you figure out who has come in from the play-in teams, then you would ask the final 2 teams to select the play-in teams and repeat from there. The only restriction that you have to worry about is that you can't have more than 1 extra of a region in your group. So, for example, let's say in a theory that, you have the 2 LPL teams in here and 1 over here. Group A could not stick the LPL 4 seed into Group B. So that way you don't end up with totally mismatched groups and one team has all the teams from a region in there. This keeps it so that it's at least within 1 of each other and you can kind of stick them in from there. Now, obviously, you're going to have to change how you play games against each other in this way. When you have 4 groups of 4, they each play each other in a double round robin. You get 6 games per team. That results in total 48 games overall that need to be played over the course of 2 weeks. If you do it this way and everyone plays each other a single round robin, you're up to 56 games. So you would have to play 1 extra game a day. It's 8 extra games total, and you would just have to play 1 more every day because every team is now playing 7 games instead of 6 because they're playing the 7 other teams in their group. You can keep the head-to-head tiebreaker, so that will get rid of a lot of tiebreakers straight away. That will happen. It's just whoever beat the other one's going to be ahead. And then it's 3-way tiebreakers that you only have to worry about. And you might have to suffer through that, but that's the case already right now. Anyways, as we saw last year at Worlds. I spelled it out here just so people could see it clearly. It's days of 7 games every time, all the way through. Similar to what it is right now across the 2 weeks of group stage, but instead of 6 games, it's 7. It's not a ton more, and I think something that most people would be able to swallow. So what is the benefit of groups done this way? Well, the biggest thing is the fact that you're gonna see a lot more matchups overall. You're not gonna see the same team get stomped twice by another team because they're not gonna beat them. Sometimes upsets happen. Of course, that's always true. But here, you're just going to see more matchups. More teams are going to play against each other. You will just have more fun, I think, watching these games. Secondly, the seeding is a lot more balanced if done this way. Even if you keep a draw system, you can, at the very least, create pools that are more fairly balanced along the way, as opposed to what we kind of do now, which is having to stick 4 teams in there. It doesn't necessarily feel accurate all the time. Third, and most importantly, I would argue, is that coming out of the groups, you have a clear top to bottom picture of how to seed your bracket going forward. Assuming this kind of thing, you can obviously argue the distribution a little bit, but you'll have a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4, as opposed to 4 1s and 4 2s. This makes it easy for the 1 to play the 4 from the opposite group, as opposed to having to then draw to see which 1 should play which 2 because you don't know which 2 and which 1s are stronger than who. So even if you can't staple on double elimination, lower bracket going forward. With this system, with just 8 extra games, you can at least seed this bracket going forward so much better. But I would still like to make a case for how to do a double round robin elimination tournament while compressing it down into 3 weeks. So let's look at that next. Alrighty, does this look familiar to anyone from North America? If you're not from North America, I'll let you in on a secret. It's our summer playoff bracket. Now, before you roll your eyes about 8 teams in playoffs, it's much better when you have 16 teams and 8 teams from a world tournament to seed into this bracket. And even then, this was the best playoffs North America has ever had. I know a lot of people from Europe might roll their eyes at that, but we had a ton of best of 5s. They were very close. It was very fun. And I think this bracket is a great setup for how to do a world system. You have the number 1 seed from Group A and Group B being seeded into a bye situation. You have 2 and 3 from each group going into this area here. And then you have the 4th seed auto-seeded into the loser's bracket. It makes the stakes so high in group stage because it's going to give you certain advantages and disadvantages in this playoff bracket. Now, I haven't populated this one just so you can take a look at what it would look like coming directly out of group stage. But in theory, you can get matchups that look like this, where I just assume the higher seed wins the whole way through. So you get Group B's number 2 and number 3 playing against each other, and you're going to assume that the number 2 seed from Group B is better, and so you're going to have them lined up to play against the A seed's number 1, or the A group's number 1 seed. So that way you'll get number 2 versus number 1. Same thing down here. And the loser will be seeded in such a way, again, assuming that 3 loses, they should play B's number 4 seed to get these kinds of matchups that we haven't seen yet at Worlds. Here, the bracket is prioritizing avoiding best of 5 repeats over best of 1 repeats. So even though Group A's 2 and 3 seed played against each other a single time in group stage, it's probably better to replay that than replaying this matchup here that already happened in the bracket. Also, please ignore, I should have said this, ignore all the win. I just copy and pasted this graphic off the internet and I was too lazy to cover up these. Please ignore the wins. That doesn't reflect if what I'm saying is winning here. Anyways, you'll then kind of get the 2 seeds versus each other, a 1 versus a 2 seed, and then finally a grand finals waiting out over here. Now, the important question is, how does this break out in terms of Worlds dates? Well, it breaks out beautifully. You have 4 best of 5s every single week of the 3 weeks. This way the tournament doesn't lose momentum, which kind of happens right now for Worlds, where you go from 4 best of 5s, then a big gap down to 2, and then a really big gap down to 1. This keeps the momentum of the tournament up all the way through. There's a little bit of wiggle room for exactly which matches happen on which days. Here, I prioritize making sure that no one is actually going to be killed through the first round of week 1. So if you see here, I'm basically playing the winner's side. I'm playing this whole part of the bracket during week 1. In theory, you could do these 4 matches, and someone will be dead at the end of it. And the only downside is that one of these two teams aren't going to play during one of these weeks. You can debate amongst yourselves which matches you think should go in week 1 and week 2, and when people should get their 1 week off. If you do this side of the bracket, this part of the bracket first, then these losers bracket teams are going to have some time to scrim and try and fix their problems. I think that's pretty cool. At the same time, you could do these ones first and give this group, as the 1 seed, an extra week off to recover. I think given how it's just best of 1s deciding a pretty big advantage already in their favor of not only having an extra life but being preceded, I would prefer to give the teams down here an extra week to scrim and try and fix their problems. That makes sense to me, but you can debate exactly how you think this should go. The biggest question for me around a format like this is actually the physical limitations that we were kind of talking about before, of whether or not you can get across a country in the 3 days and set everything up that you might have. That's a really quick turnaround time, and you would be forced to make sure that your cities are closer together across the tournament. So I don't think there's a way, for example, right now to go from New York, or from New York to Atlanta you could probably do, but from Atlanta to San Francisco, that's a big ask. You would probably need to actually move Atlanta then to somewhere in the middle of the country to make sure you can kind of make a line across it. And moving forward, this is not just a NA problem. If you're going across big parts of China, if you're doing tournaments in like Southeast Asia where they've done it before and gone to different countries, you're gonna have to have time to move all this stuff around. So you'll need to make sure that it actually lines up and is doable. Given the fact that, right now for North America in group stage, we're keeping it in New York City between groups and quarters where there is 4 games or 4 days of broadcast every single time. It does make me worry if this is not possible. And if that is the case, you can start doing other solves in the future. We'll talk about future proofing in a second here, but here, the nice thing about this is at the very least, you can maybe make an extra week that has a 2-day thing here. And that will also help balance out when people are playing in this part. So you could make a 6-week maybe, but again, that's kind of break my own rules. If it is literally physically impossible to do this, I think you have to start asking, you know, what's more important, the traveling across the country or the double elim bracket, if you believe that it's more important. Now, I've said future proof a couple times in this video, and the reason I've said that is because a group system with only 2 groups allows you to make changes substantially easier than if you have 4 groups of 4. How do you decide who to take out of those groups then? You have to do it evenly, of course. And if you have 4 groups, then you must take 4 or 8 or 12 or 16. But if you have just 2 groups, you can pull 2, 4, 6, 8, or 10, you know, you can start rigging the situation to be much easier to solve. It's the same thing for which number of teams you let into the tournament. When you have 4 groups, you must let in 4 teams, 8 teams, 12 teams, or 16 teams in to make those groups. Here, you could just kill these 2. Just get rid of that, and it still works fine. Then only 2 teams don't make it, and the top 8 move out, you know? You can make changes to this format much easier. This can also change the seeding over here. Maybe you only want 6 teams to get out of groups. Well, then you just take the top 3, and you don't need to worry about what do you do with the other 2 spots that you're losing if you have 4 groups. 2 groups makes it so much easier to decide how many teams make it into the tournament, how many teams get out of the group stage, how you make a bracket, because you can make a double elim bracket with only 6 teams. That's what North America uses in Spring Split. If you want to copy Spring Split's bracket, you can make a more brutal group stage and maybe put in a couple little protections to make sure that, you know, teams are really the best teams getting out. And then you have these 6 teams make it. It's easier to make tweaks when the groups are bigger and pressed together. If you have 4 groups of 4, it puts a lot of constraints on how many teams you can put in the tournament. That's gonna do it for this episode of The Blame Game. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to let me know what you guys think down in the comments below here, and if this ends up on Reddit, I would love to hear if you guys like my proposal, if you like the VCT proposal, you disagree with me on any of this stuff, you think I've overlooked something, I would love to hear it. And I would also love to hear from people who have been long-term viewers of either LEC or LCS and can remember when there was no winner's bracket or loser's bracket, when there's no double elim in our regional league. And did your enjoyment of the league change at all with the inclusion of the lower bracket? Let me know. Anyways, I'll catch you guys later. Hopefully when Worlds is just around the corner, we'll have some more actual gameplay type stuff to focus on. Catch you guys then.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching that video. This is my press conference here. Does the lens show the full table? Do they know? Okay, good. I look like I'm at a press conference. I ad-libbed that part, and then I was worried that it wouldn't make sense if the crop was... Anyway, so I'm here at Chicago Finals. I want to shout out Alienware for helping to get me here. For years and years and years, I've been traveling to events now, and it's all because of their support. Really appreciate them as a sponsor. Please check out the link in the description. If you purchase something through there, it actually goes directly to helping support the channel. A portion of it does. And yeah, thank you so much to Alienware. I'm going to avoid deep dish pizza for the rest of this trip.